Welcome to this week's Foundation Friday. I am joined today by Michael Fanger, President of Eastern Funding. Thanks for joining me, Michael.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
And no, I appreciate your time, and we're here today to discuss the Woodwell Climate Research Center. So if you don't mind, we just kind of introduce the center, sir?
Yes, I will. So the Woodwell Climate Research Center is a think tank. It was founded over 30 years ago by a man named George Woodwell. It was renamed a couple of years ago. It had a different name that got confused with a larger institution here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, called the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So to differentiate itself and make clear in its community, it's called the Woodwell Climate Research Center. What they do is pure scientific research globally on climate change, human-caused climate change. And they focus on the Arctic and the tropics. So the Amazon, for example, or the Arctic, for example, in Alaska. And they try to take that research and then impact policy and communities, from local communities to national governments, to the global community. And it's widely recognized now that human-caused climate change is perhaps one of the greatest threats to humanity. And in fact, it's becoming very apparent, whether it's the floods in Kentucky recently, or the wildfires annually out west, or the big drought down in the Southwest. The human-caused climate change is now with us and having impacts and severely impacting people. In India recently, it's impossible even to be outside very long. And so people that depend on farming to eat are going to be impacted, are already being impacted in a major way. So what's interesting about this organization is it's a relatively small organization, but they're very influential. In fact, the most recent president is now in the White House and is the climate advisor to President Biden. And this was true under the Obama administration. The former president was the White House science advisor. So this institution has a history of having a lot of influence, not only in this country, but globally. And that's because of their scientific excellence. So despite having a small staff, they have top-notch scientists dedicated their lives to this. And so, I first became aware of them from my mom, who moved here years ago with my dad for a summer home, and met George Woodwell when the organization was young. And back around 2015, she's in her 80s. She decided to retire, but she wanted me to get involved to continue the work that she had done, because she had done very good work attracting directors to the board and serving on the board, and influencing the direction of the organization. Going back to the founding, the fellow George Woodwell has an eminent scientific background, starting with working to show the effects of DDT on animals and crops and humans, and was involved back in the 1960s. That research led to the eradication of DDT, which is now allowing eagles, for example, to recover. And so this was important ecosystem work done on Long Island, actually, and studying the forest and the impact of DDT. So he eventually made his way to Woods Hole. He was working at the Marine Biological Labs. There's a number of scientific organizations located here that were originally established in the early part of the 20th century, just by coincidence. And he left there around, I guess, 1985 to start the Climate Center. And he testified to Congress either in that year or the early 80s with Jim Hansen, who's perhaps as well known or a little bit better known, famous climate scientist who foretold what we're seeing now. that human-caused climate change, which is not newly studied, I'll get to that in a second, but was going to change the course of human life and animal life on the planet. And so climate scientists have been the most accurate forecasters. You talk about people, we often talk about forecasting the stock market or interest rates, especially in our business. Well, the only ones forecasters who have been accurate, unfortunately, are climate scientists, and they weren't bold enough in outlining exactly how fast the impacts were going to happen. So the real issue is what is called natural feedback loops, which at some point the planet takes over, and it's like too late. It's best not to believe that. And in fact, scientists at the Climate Center do have some optimism that things that can change. Among some of the other things they do are study forests. A lot of work is done with the forest because the forest and the soils are what is called a carbon sink, meaning that the Earth's natural systems absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. The oceans absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's a book that I will send you that's an easy book to read for non-scientists like myself that explains it all. And the problem is that industry, we're still burning too much in the way of fossil fuels, and because we eat a lot of meat, too much of that. So scientists there are experts in forests, and just for example, in Canada, I spoke to one of the scientists because you may remember there was a place, I think Fort McHenry, Canada, just in the last couple of years, I think out west in the Canadian Rockies. The town almost burned to the ground, and it was a good sized town. And so the TV images of people leaving their homes and driving through the embers, just like the place in California, the campfire is what it was called. Just these horrific stories. And so I spoke to him about that. I said, geez, wow, what a fire, just amazing. He says, Michael, those fires are going on all the time. We're not aware of it because they're not near a town where somebody's home is going to be burned down. But one of the things the center does is they do a lot of satellite work with what is called remote sensing, which can measure ground cover of a particular plot of land. So I'll tell you about two major projects, and then I'll take a breath and allow you to ask a follow-up question. So they do a lot of work in the Arctic. The climate is warming in the Arctic faster than anywhere else on the globe. I mean, they have 90-degree days there sometime. And it's this feedback loop that I was describing is self-perpetuating because when there's less ocean ice, then there's less reflection up into the atmosphere. And there's more dark water, absorbs more heat. So it creates this feedback loop where it's feeding on itself. And so one of the projects they measure permafrost thaw, because when the permafrost, which is this frozen ground, has been frozen for tens of thousands of years, thaws, it releases massive amounts of CO2 because in the ground up there is all this organic material, because at one point it was trees and animals and shrubs, but there's been nothing there because it's been frozen for eons. Now it's thawing, and it's also releasing methane. And methane is much more potent than CO2. So so the center received its largest award ever this year from a group called Audacious, which you should be aware of, because it's the kind of philanthropy that Equipment Finance Cares ultimately should have some exposure to. You have ever watched a TED Talk?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Audacious is a project of TED, the organization that produces the TED Talks. And this year, the Audacious project gave out $900 million from the wealthiest people globally. in secret. You don't know who they are. The only person that was identified was, I think it was Steve Jobs. I'm sorry, it may have been Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. Yeah. So Woodwell got a $41 million grant. Now, all that money doesn't come to Woodwell, but it also, they're subcontracting or partnering with Harvard University has a center that does a lot of climate research and others. And in that, they're going to expand their Arctic monitoring capabilities to have more stations, this equipment that monitors permafrost loss, to monitor and evaluate the flux, meaning the increase in carbon and methane being emitted into the atmosphere. The reason this is important is obviously you've heard of the Paris Climate Accords, and that's where countries made pledges. And the idea is they're studying how much carbon is released, but in none of that was mentioned the thaw of the Arctic. So this is something that is unique to Woodwell in pushing forward to make it known to policymakers that you need to include permafrost thaw in your budgets, or else you're just kidding yourselves.
Yeah.
So that's an important aspect where you take the science and then influence the policymakers and try to influence human behavior to do more faster. So, like for example, unfortunately, the Ukraine war is a big setback, and so Europe is now burning more coal because they have to. On the other hand, they've pledged to double down and move much faster towards their percentage of renewable energy involved. And so before I stop, that's they do the similar work in the Amazon. They had a lot of success in the Amazon with policy impact. The policy impact was reducing the level of deforestation. That was the policy impact. So they did research to show how the temperature change when you cut down trees for agriculture in the Amazon. That land that is now farmland is 10 degrees warmer than the rainforest. Now, we both know this from being in New York City or some other major city in the summer is much hotter than being someplace else out in the forest. We know that logically. What's happening down there is the drought, and you're now starting to get a feedback loop where ever more fires from a drier climate, less rain impacts the ability to grow crops. So the ag industry is now getting on board. This is another impact of this organization. Their scientists working with the agricultural producers, the soy producers, understand that if they don't have some type of a program addressing climate change, their crop yields are going to decline. So that's just another element of it. It's a very complicated process because what Brazil did years ago was they opened up the rainforest to people, because of the burgeoning population. They said, well, go into the jungle and, go there and make a living. And so all these people are out there, thousands of people, and they're like, okay, we're here. You told us to come here. Now you're telling us we can't grow crops, or we can't raise cattle, or we can't cut down trees. So it's a very complicated human problem. But it's fascinating. And where it relates to equipment finance and my own personal interests, you can go back to laundry. There's other areas also. So we finance some solar in a very limited way. I really want to do a lot more, but I haven't sort of figured out a way in. It's done by many banks, as you know, at very large scale. And we're really a small scale lender, small business lender, but we have definitely done solar projects on top of buildings for laundromats, covered parking for customers that have liquor stores. And they tell me, the ones that have done this, it's like a no-brainer in terms of a rate of return on investment. So they're doing something good for themselves, and it's good for the environment. It's win-win. And that's really kind of what I'm all about. And we've really reached that stage, and people some politicians will tell you, oh, it's bad for the economy. That's like the person that owns the horse and buggy company telling you, yeah, you don't bring the car because that's bad for the economy. Cars, Henry Ford, that's bad for the economy. Don't do that. It's literally what it's like. Because the fact is John Doerr, who's I encourage you to hear his recent podcast on Masters in Business, and then there was another one. But he's been out there. He gave 100 million himself to Stanford. Stanford has just raised 750 million for climate related education research. But he says that he's one of the leading venture capitalists of our era for the last 30 years. Some of the largest tech companies in America, he had a role in backing. And he says that the change to a clean economy is the greatest economic opportunity of his lifetime, of our lifetimes. And I believe that. And starting to see evidence of it. Ford Motors investing 50 billion in electric vehicles. John Deere, I heard a fascinating podcast with the CEO of John Deere, how technology in the ag business is changing everything, and climate is part of it. Reducing the amount of fertilizer they need to get the yields that they want, and being more efficient in growing. And so there's just a lot going on. That is room for some optimism about it. What else can I tell you about the Woodwell Climate Research Center?
No, I mean, that was a fantastic overview, and I love the passion that you have for something that's definitely needed. It's just, you shake your head after a while because it's like, why isn't? But anyhow, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. When
Human
people
nature.
make it, I don't know. Did you see the movie Don't Look Up?
Yeah, I haven't watched the whole thing. I have to watch it. It's a good movie. I have to go back to it and finish it. Leonardo DiCaprio, right?
Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think it was Jennifer Lawrence was in it too, but
yeah,
ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
When people make a donation, Michael, to obviously they get grants, right? When people make a donation, even if it's smaller amount, where do the donated dollars go?
Okay, so individual donors such as myself, I've given a general unrestricted funding, and that goes to support the science in the following way: that governments and foundations only give to the science. The problem is all these organizations have overhead. They have an accountant, they may have a communications director, they have rent, they have what is called indirect costs. And the grants don't cover that. So science, the funding for science is a little bit dysfunctional, and it may get addressed over the years, but the funders want to be able to say to the people that give them money, foundations, for example, the MacArthur Foundation, trying to think of another major one, but that's a good one. The Moore Foundation. Moore, of course, was one of the inventors of the microprocessor and was at Intel. So giant foundation, they give a lot to science. They've been donors to Woodwell. So they'll make a large grant, say $4 million. The problem is the larger the grant, so that's the good news, like, oh, we're getting all this money, but then you have to raise indirect money, because you can't just do the science, because somebody has to pay the bills, and somebody has to turn on the lights or make the computers function. And
interesting. So that doesn't go to any of the administration stuff whatsoever. It purely has to go. Wow. Okay. I did not.
Yeah, the whole philanthropic world, you can Google this, and this will, in fact, this impacts Equipment Finance Cares now, because when you, to a certain extent, like Debbie's organization, which I like to learn more about, again, if they raise from funders, some of them may, again, they have requirements, and so there's direct expense and indirect. So that's just one feature. I happen to like I've been involved for a long time. I give in unrestricted, so they can use it for whatever purpose. It would be for salaries, it would be for rent, it would be um, potentially for some of the scientific research. But last year, what I did, they were going. A number of the staff was going to COP 26 in Edinburgh, which is a global meeting that they have periodically. There's another one coming up where countries meet to discuss what they're doing and to make new commitments on this. And we have a scientist who's done a lot of work in the Congo over the years, which outside of the Amazon is the largest rainforest remaining in the world. And one of their government officials did not have funding to go to the meeting. And so I volunteered to pay for that person to go to the Congo. So that was an example of something that I knew, I became aware of it. And so I made a donation to do that. And in retrospect, they were very thankful. It was very helpful. This fellow, obviously they were very grateful. And it just, it helps with the relationships and with the work they're doing at these events, which is to talk about, obviously work in the Congo is important. It's under threat. Just recently, the head of the government there said he doesn't care about humanity. He's opening up more of the rainforest to mineral drilling and discovery because he's got people that he needs to feed. So there's a constant sort of, back and forth on these issues. But that was one example. Another example coming up is they're doing a Capitol Hill Day. Our industry does its own Capitol Hill Day, and I've decided I'm gonna sponsor, part of the expense of the Capitol Hill Day, and I'm gonna go with the scientists as they walk around the Capitol. So those are a couple of examples of things they're doing. They have something else that's very unique, which after the 2016 presidential election, there was a feeling that the administration at that time in Washington was not going to be friendly to climate change initiatives. And so the former director, who's now back in the White House, started what is called the Fund for Climate Solutions. And that was a $10 million fund that they've now raised. Took them a number of years. And the purpose of that was to make seed grants available to scientists who weren't otherwise funded for certain research. And it was competitive. So this is an internal venture capital fund at the center. And in fact, it's been very successful. It's all kinds of different things. For example, one project is the restoration of marshland here on Cape Cod. Former bogs, cranberry bogs that had been turned from marsh into a cranberry bog maybe 100 years ago, and that no longer is a functioning cranberry bog, but has affected the environment where there's no longer the tidal benefit of these marshlands to protect from flooding. And obviously it affects ecosystems, the animals, the birds, the fish. And so there have been a number of examples on Cape Cod. There's one underway now that is not, I don't think Woodwell was involved. It's just a town of Wellfleet. I was just reading in the paper. They are in the process now of restoring tidal marshes just by removing like a dike, and they want to restore herring. So the herring used to, run up in great quantities, back and forth. So that type of thing, that's among the type of projects that they might do. So the Fund for Climate Solutions, there was a grant for this permafrost research. And in fact, that led to this $41 million grant. So it started with a $90,000 grant from the Fund for Climate Solutions, which is this internal venture capital fund where there's awards made every year for small grants. They often lead to larger grants. So this $90,000 grant for the additional research on permafrost melt in the Arctic led to a $3 million grant from a foundation in Britain, where these British billionaires have agreed to give away $100 million a year to climate change research. And the center was fortunate to get some funding. And that then led to a $41 million grant. So the idea is this hopefully is something, I'm hopeful the institution will continue with this. The reason I mention it is because our own industry, there are examples in philanthropy of revolving funds and doing impact investing where you might actually, just for example, you might make a donation to an organization, and that organization then hires a grant writer, and they go out and apply for a larger grant to do certain work that they want to do. So just there needs to be creativity because what the former president, his name is Phil Duffy, by the way, who's in the White House. You can Google him. He's a eminent scientist and really had a lot to do with raising the profile and the institution overall. But what he saw was that the funding model was broken, meaning that there are fewer and fewer government grants. Over a period of time, government grants are shrinking in general in any field, not just for climate, whether for medical research or other. So they're harder and harder to get, and when you get one, they're smaller. So in one sense, this organization and others, like science, for example, what the scientist does is he writes a grant proposal, he gets funded, and that funds his salary. That's how these institutions work. That was the funding model for Woodwell, along with small amounts of donor funds and grants from foundations like the Moore Foundation. But government grants from NASA, from the National Science Foundation are very common funds coming from the government, and this organization had a good percentage of that to fund their research. And you can look that up. National Science Foundation is a government agency, and NASA, obviously, we know what that is. NOAA, the National Organization of I forget administration. Whether it's not aviation, but it's they study the weather. It has to do with the weather and so forth. And so that's shrinking over time, and so you have to be innovative about where you seek funding. So I applaud you for what you're doing with Equipment Finance Cares, and I would encourage you to think creatively about the future of that. Like I explained to you how Laundry Cares, what's happened is they started hand to mouth, like asking other people in the industry for funds, but at the same time, they are now have reached out to private funders in philanthropy because there's a lot directed to childhood literacy.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So when people in our industry watch this video or they read our press release on, the Climate Research Center, what can they do to, help make a difference?
Well, on climate change in particular, obviously they could go to the website because it's a fascinating website. They have a very good communications team, and they have some great films. So one of them is called Climate Emergency, and that was not produced by the center. That was produced by an independent producer, but there's a lot of the scientists that speak. So I would encourage them to get educated, not only about this organization, but to see the films. And I will forward you the links. And
then what I will do is I will put the links in the press release. So when people see this, it'll be underneath them. So then they don't have to poke around, look for them.
And then the next thing to do, obviously in their personal lives, like I'm putting solar on my house, and it's supposed to be a 10% return. And I hope that I can reduce my own carbon footprint personally. But in our work, as I explained to you, I'm hopeful over time there'll be opportunities to finance battery-powered vehicles. So in fact, we just financed a few battery-powered vehicles. You may know we finance tow and recovery vehicles. And what I'm told is that the application so far is just these vehicles are too big and they idle. And so you would drain the battery too quickly. So, and they're so heavy, the batteries are so heavy, the vehicles are already very heavy. I'm hopeful that in time, there may be some application. But
Sure.
what I'm saying is that if the entire equipment finance industry, obviously a lot of them are already involved in renewables, whether it's wind turbines, solar, and many other areas, EVs. I know there's a lot of activity, but just to be open to that because it's good for your business as well as good for the country and humanity.
Well, excellent, sir. Well, I appreciate your time today, talking about this. For those individuals watching this, there'll be some links afterwards. Just check it out, and let's do our part to combat this, global crisis.
Thank you, and keep in touch with me about Equipment Finance Cares because I'd like to.